I'm Jim Mars, and I'm here today to talk to you about our occulted history. Now, let me quickly point out that this has nothing to do with devil worship or witches or vampires or zombies, not in the occult that we normally think of it. This is the term occulted used in the astronomical sense, meaning when the moon eclipses the sun, that's called an occultation. It masks or it hides the sun. So our occulted history simply means our hidden history. The Big Bang Theory, the idea that there were just energy in space and it coalesced and it kind of scrunched down and created tremendous pressure and then released an explosion and threw bits of energy and matter off into the universe, and they spun out and they cooled and they created galaxies and they created suns and then planets, and then evolution started. This is, of course, what we've all been taught in school, but even the Big Bang Theory today is being questioned. In a recent edition of Scientific America, it says quantum gaps in the Big Bang Theory. So it is simply a theory, and we're finding out new things all along. One of the things we're finding out is, and one of the big questions that it's on a growing number of people's mind is there a 10th planet out there? Or as the ancient Sumerians called it, the 12th planet. And there's really no contradiction, because the ancient Sumerians counted the sun and the moon as planets within our solar system, and our scientific establishment does not. So we had at one point 9 planets, but actually now we've only got 8, because poor old Pluto has been relegated back from a planet to simply a body, kind of a moonlet or asteroid, or even worse than that, I guess Pluto became Mickey Mouse's dog. But we're learning all kinds of things about the solar system. They have located a planet outside the solar system that they think is part of our system. And this goes back to the 80s, when there were actually mainstream stories about this. Today we don't hear much except for conspiracy websites that talk about the 10th planet, or Planet X, or Nibiru, or Wormwood, whatever you want to call it. But there does seem to be something out there. And it may very well be what is causing perturbations in the orbits of some of the planets in our solar system, and also could be behind the strange environmental changes that are taking place on this planet. There obviously is environmental change. Now, global warming, that's been played up to try to push through a global carbon tax. And sorry, Al Gore, but it's not just driving our SUVs. The proof is in that the ice caps on Mars are diminishing, melting. Ice on some of the moons of Jupiter are melting. Outer planets are becoming more luminescent, which means that they're heating up. And so whatever is happening, it's solar system wide. It's not just our planet. And it could be evidence that there is another body moving into our solar system. Actually, an account of the creation of our solar system can be found in texts that are thousands of years old and predate the Bible by several thousand years. And these are the tablets of the Sumerian civilization. Actually, it's ironic, but we can know more about the Sumerians than we'll ever know about the Egyptians or the Romans, because they all wrote everything down on papyrus, on paper, and it disintegrated and burned up and got lost in wars. The Sumerians carved their writing into clay tablets and then baked them, and they turned to stone, and there are perhaps a 500,000 of them still in existence in the basements of museums all around the world. Interestingly enough, only about 20% of them have been translated, and yet when translated, we find that they give us a history of our own solar system. We now know that the Sumerians, as can be seen in this stele, knew the positions of the planets and their relative sizes. And yet we also know that Uranus was not known to modern man until it was discovered in 1781. Neptune was discovered in 1846, and Pluto not until 1930. So they actually were way ahead of us in their knowledge of the heavens. According to the Sumerian tablets, everything began with a huge planet called Tiamat. And Tiamat was located between Mars and Jupiter. And it was a huge planet, much larger than the Earth, and was a watery planet full of water. In their cuneiform tablets, the Sumerian told us of the war in heavens, the clashes that took place, and as read as a metaphor for the creation of our solar system, it tells an incredible story. It tells of another planet known as Nibiru, known as the planet of the crossing, and that's because Nibiru apparently has an orbit that takes it outside our solar system and cycles around every 3,600 years, or approximately. And that would constitute one of their years. And it is destined to return to the vicinity of the Earth in 2060, but that means it could be nearing our solar system now. And some people believe this might be the cause of the erratic weather and environmental changes that we see taking place on the Earth. As recently as 2012, there are astronomers who claim they have found evidence of another heavenly body in our solar system. So this is not just sheer theory. The only theory comes in as to what this object might be. Is it another planet? Is it a dwarf sun that's imploded? Is it a dark hole? You know, we're not sure. And of course, the government acts like there's nothing going on. But then what else is new? So according to this ancient account, thousands of years ago, when Nibiru passed into our solar system, it passed near to the watery planet of Tiamat, and one of the moons of Nibiru actually struck Tiamat and demolished about half of that world, causing it to just go into bits and pieces, but it continued in the orbit of Tiamat. This is today what we know as the asteroid belt. The other half of Tiamat coalesced and was pushed into orbit past Mars, and that is what has come to be known as our Earth. And this could explain why Martian rocks and Martian fossils have been found on the Earth, and why that some of the water samples have shown evidence of Martian life, because it started off as Tiamat and then ended up here. So it actually came from Tiamat and not Mars. So today we have the solar system as we know it today, which is Mercury, Mars, Venus, and then Mars, and then the Earth, and then the asteroid belt, and then Jupiter, Saturn, and the outer planets. This could explain many things, including the origin of comets that are like icy balls flying through space. Where do they come from? They are bits and pieces of debris from the destruction of the planet Tiamat. There are other oddities and strange things going on within our solar system. There are some of the moons that are very questionable. Even the famous astronomer Carl Sagan, early in his career, along with some Russian scientists, expressed the belief that perhaps one of the moons of Mars, Phobos, was actually an artificial satellite. And they said this because it gave evidence of being hollow, and as Carl Sagan noted, a natural satellite cannot be a hollow object. Later on, he kind of backpedaled and acted like, well, we don't really know, and he fell more into line with conventional wisdom as he gained popularity and fame and fortune. But even today, there are those who point to Phobos as being a very strange world. Another moon that has really fascinated me is Iapetus, one of the moons of Saturn. And it, like our own moon, it's always facing Saturn, and it's in a very permanent orbit going around that ringed planet. But what's even more astounding, as you can see here, is there's a ridge of mountains or hills or a wall that circles Iapetus. Every time I look at this, it reminds me of the wall on Kong Island to separate the natives from King Kong. But it even gets stranger because, as you can see from these pictures, it has a big, huge crater, and it's got that line right across the equator, and it looks nothing less than like the Death Star in the film Star Wars. It's also known as the Yin-Yang planet because it has an odd shadow on it that makes it look like the ancient Chinese yin and yang symbol. So there's something very strange about Iapetus. And then that brings up our own moon. Our own moon, there's a lot of strange things about our own moon, and there is some evidence it may be hollow. In 1969, when the Apollo 12 crew dropped their lander back onto the lunar surface, NASA officials announced that the moon vibrated and rang like a bell for hours. Well, that's only possible if the moon is predominantly hollow. Interestingly enough, I had a conversation with one of the astronauts who'd been to the moon, and I said, what do you think about the idea that the moon's hollow? And he kind of laughed and said, no, the moon's not hollow. But then he went on to say that scientists believe there may be giant caverns within the moon. And of course, here was a famous astronaut. I didn't want to get in his face, but you know, hollow moon and giant caverns in the moon, what's the difference? It's emptiness in there. And there's a lot of intriguing things about our moon, none the least of which is how to get to be there in the first place. When I was a young man in school, we were taught that the moon broke away from the Earth, was part of the Earth at some point, and then broke away and didn't explain how, and then went into orbit around the Earth. But now, since we've been to the moon and we have moon rocks, and we know that their composition is entirely different from the mineral compositions found on Earth, that it came from somewhere else. Interestingly enough, today they have the Big Whack theory, and although they make fun of the theories of ETs here and collisions in the past and the Sumerian tablets account of the creation of our solar system, they are now saying that the moon is probably the product of a collision between a planetary object and another planetary object in our solar system that created the moon. So in essence, they are beginning to go in the same direction as the Anunnaki story, the story of Nibiru, the story of the space travelers, and the story of Tiamat being struck by one of the moons of Nibiru millions of years ago. But the key question about our own moon is how to get to where it is. The famous astronomer Isaac Asimov said the moon should not be where it is. And what was he talking about? He's talking about, here's the Earth, the moon comes from somewhere else. It passes the Earth, it's caught in the gravitational field, and it's pulled back. Okay, it goes past the Earth again, caught in the gravitational field, comes back again. So over time, it goes into orbit around the Earth, so it ought to be in kind of a wobbly, elliptical orbit around the Earth, but it's not. It's in a near perfect circular orbit, going right around the equator with one side always facing the Earth. How does this happen naturally? Well, actually it doesn't. But this shows the circular logic that we're in today. We know that the only way the moon could be in the position it is if some intelligence parked it there. We know that it's just the proper distance from the Earth to completely cover the circumference of the sun when there's an eclipse. So it has to be in just a certain position. We also know that it's in this orbit that's circular and it's stationary, and the only way that could happen is if some intelligence parked it that way. Well, our circular thinking is this. We know the moon's been there all through our history, so we know that we didn't park it in place. We also know there's no such things as aliens, and so we just won't talk about this. And that's where science is today on the moon. But there's other aspects of the moon that are just as puzzling. Here's a NASA photograph of what is known as the Shard. This is something that's a mile high, reaching up from the surface of the moon. And we don't know exactly what it is. Is it a radio antenna, some kind of tower? We don't know. But in the blow-up box, you can see, don't worry about the little X thing. That is simply a registration mark on the photograph. But the object is very strange and has never been explained. Also in these NASA photographs, we see cylindrical shaped objects passing in front of the moon, moving along the moon, and in the lower right-hand corner, such an object seems to be jutting out from the sides of a crater. This is one of my favorite photographs. It shows what appears to be like a round rock rolling down from the side of a crater and leaving tracks on the moon. And this is, of course, a slide taken from a picture that was published, so it's not a very clear picture, but in the original, you can actually see these tracks move up the side of the crater and then down the side, which kind of destroys the idea that it was just some kind of round rock rolling down the side of the crater by accident. And if you'll look up to the upper part, you see some other tracks leading out in the moon. Now this, along with lights seen on the moon, moving lights on the moon, winds of water and gas passing along, some evidence of wind on the moon. We now know that the moon has a small but nevertheless present magnetic field. So a lot of what we thought we knew about the moon has been proven to be not true. There's a lot of activity going on the moon. We also know that there's other strange artifacts in our solar system. In the Cydonia region of Mars, of course, we have the infamous face on Mars, which they've tried to say, well, there's nothing there, and yet certain times of the day it appears to be a human face. We've got pyramids on Mars, and interestingly enough, they tend to mimic the pyramids in configuration, both in Mexico and on the Giza Plateau in Egypt. All of which then tends to say that there has been intelligent life visiting in our solar system for thousands of years. But how about our own planet? Yes, the evidence becomes even more compelling. On our own planet, we have a small axe found embedded in rock that dates back up to 1 million years. We've got the Piri Reis map that was done in the 1500s by a Turkish admiral who said he got the maps from earlier Greek maps, and they in turn based on even earlier maps. And in his maps, we can see the correct coastline of Antarctica, which was not known because it's been under hundreds of feet of ice for centuries, and the actual coastline was not known until the advent of radar, when they used ground-penetrating radar to determine the coastline, and yet the Piri Reis maps show accurately the coastline of Antarctica. It also shows the tributaries of the Amazon River, something that was not known until there were flyovers during the geophysical year of 1958. So where did he get that? Well, he got them from much earlier maps, and what's really fascinating to me is these earlier maps tend to distort as you get further out in distance. The coastlines and the riverbeds tend to elongate. This is exactly what you see on photographs taken from high in the atmosphere, because you get the curvature of the earth and it begins to distort the edges of the landmass that you're taking a picture of. So in other words, these ancient maps that were drawn during the 1500s, based on Greek maps that were based on even earlier maps, show evidence of having been copied from aerial photographs. In fact, if you'll study the ancient cultures on the earth, every single one of them has legends and stories of gods who come from the sky, travel in flying machines, are able to wreak destruction with a single weapon, and these gods transcend all of these cultures. You find these stories in Central and South America, China, Australia, Africa, Egypt, everywhere. And the common denominator is flight. They all say that these people were able to fly through the air. Here we see evidences of saucer-shaped objects can be found historically and India, Africa, Italy, various places. The piece of rusty looking equipment here is the Antikythera mechanism, which was discovered in a Greek ship back in the early 1900s. They didn't know what it was, but it has since been found to be a complicated series of cogs and wheels, and it's part of an early day computer. And it is geared towards analyzing the movement of the constellations. So they had some kind of very high technology in the ancient past.